everybody. How are you? So when people ask you what's going on in the Supreme Court, I don't know how many of you go and check what did Bloomberg say, but I often do, and that means I check what Greg said. Greg is one of the most astute observers of the unpredictable and interesting activities of the United States Supreme Court in cases that you've heard of and cases that you haven't heard of. His very interesting and well-received book about the affirmative action cases is something that's worth your time reading. And I promised I wouldn't say very much, and so that he has more time, but he is an alum of the Harvard Law School. So you might even ask him something about that. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Dean, very much. Thanks. Thanks. It's a lot of fun to be here. I actually have not been back here in quite a while. I haven't actually been in this building, so it's a real treat to be here and to be with all of you. What I want to talk about is I've been covering the Supreme Court since 1998, and what I'd like to talk about is how what I do and basically how I think the public understands legal developments, legal news, like Supreme Court decisions, how that has changed over the years in a way that I kind of find troubling. And it is part of kind of a broader phenomenon of the way we all consume news these days. But I think it has some sort of special significance for legal news. So let me first just start off talking a little bit about Bloomberg and what I do, just by way of background. So Bloomberg, as a company, makes its money by selling basically a single product to people with a lot of money at stake. It's a product that has financial data and analytical tools and trading platforms, and it's something like $20,000 a year, and it only makes sense to buy if you have a lot of money at stake in the markets. And Bloomberg News started off as sort of a part of that, and so we were really focused on financial news. And we would, just like we would provide information on the new General Motors bond, we would also provide a news story on General Motors' earnings report or the big court decision that might break up Microsoft or what the Fed's going to do on rates. And over time, Bloomberg has spread out because we realize that people actually care about things other than just financial news. And we sort of go back and forth in terms of how much we want to focus on non-financial and how much we want to sort of return to the basics of financial news. I've been covering the court since 1998. I'm one of, I would say, 25 people or so who cover the court as our primary beat. There are probably half of us who have law degrees. The other half are just incredibly smart and almost invariably make it such that you can't tell which of us have law degrees, but it does, at least for me, help a little bit to have some basic background in things. And we tend to be, it's a little different than a lot of reporting beats because it's a little more bookish. One of my colleagues talks about how it's reporting by highlighter. You get a Supreme Court opinion and you're trying to find the quotes in there rather than actually interviewing somebody. We spend more time reading briefs. We spend more time talking about wonky things like Article III jurisdiction. And consequently, it's the kind of beat where people stay a very long time. So I've been there, whatever that is, 17 years. And I'm one of the more senior people in the group, but Nina Totenberg has got me by 20 years or so. And there's a guy named Lyle Denniston who now writes for SCOTUS blog who's been covering the court since, I'm not making this up, the late 1950s. So Lyle has covered Chief Justice Warren, and he's still incredibly sharp. So the news from the Supreme Court, at least in terms of the law, essentially comes in three forms. You get orders, which is mostly we're granting cert in this case, we're denying cert in this case. You have arguments and you have opinions. And you also have, and I can talk about this, but it's not going to be what I'm focusing on, justices obviously make news outside the courtroom as well. Justice Breyer's doing his book tour right now, so he was on with Stephen Colbert last night, and you can tell me what you learned from that. But So let me, in terms of covering those three things, I'm talking mostly about arguments and opinions. But back when I first started covering the court, which for me sort of feels like the good old days, back in the late 90s, when one would cover an argument, you go up there, and in the arguments, there are no electronic devices that they even let the press bring in. Of course, there are no cameras there. It's just us and our pads and pens. And it can be, for me at least, a very intense experience. There's a lot of stuff you're hearing. And even if you know the case well, there's always questions that you don't understand, a reference to some case you hadn't heard about. And you're trying to write very quickly, and you're trying to understand, is Justice Kennedy suggesting he's going to vote this way or that way? And it's actually a very difficult hour in a big case. And what happens after that hour, or at least what used to happen, is we would all come downstairs, and there would be a certain amount of leisure, certainly for the daily newspapers, and even for the wires to some extent, where the reporters would stand around, and we would talk to each other, and we would say, what do you think Justice Kennedy is going to do? Which way, what did he mean by that question? And we would even compare notes because we're writing down really quickly and we didn't get the exact quote, and we would often come up with sort of the consensus of, okay, we all think that's what he said. And back in those days, the court didn't provide a transcript until a couple weeks later. So, if we decided, a justice said X, who was going to prove us wrong until nobody cared anymore. And I remember actually the newspaper reporters would very often, after an argument, go to lunch afterwards. They would take their time, they would think about what they were going to write, they would probably do a little more reading, and they would have several hours to write their story. Opinions, a little bit the same way. We, as a wire service, I would always have to put something out very quickly certainly on a big case, but certainly my colleagues in TV and newspapers had plenty of time to take the opinion, read it, as I said, highlight some things, maybe call up an intelligent person or two who knew something about the case to get his or her take about it. And they all strove, I think we all at that time strove towards a goal of, we want to give the reader a comprehensive story of this case, of this opinion. We want to, explain the majority's reasoning, talk about the implications of it, put it in the context of they could have done more, but instead they only did this. We want to get the salient points from the dissent in there. We want to get reaction from people. I think in general, I think my colleagues are a very, very smart bunch. And I think in general, we could do a very good job of that. So that was sort of the old days, and I sort of think about that as kind of the monopoly days, when we, the reporters, kind of had a monopoly on Supreme Court news. The first sort of glimmers of change that I saw were with the Bush v. Gore opinion. So that was unlike, and is still unlike anything I've ever covered at the court, just because of the speed with which that case got to the court and how quickly the court decided what obviously was a very momentous decision. For me, I cover almost exclusively the Supreme Court, but in that case, I did actually cover the first hearing before the Florida Supreme Court. And there, for the first time, and I think actually the only time, I covered a hearing by watching it on TV. The Florida Supreme Court televised, and I think still televises its arguments, or at least makes the video available. And I learned very quickly in doing that, if I didn't know it already, that it is impossible to watch a hearing, take down quotes that you want to use in the story, so you need to get them exact, try to figure out which way this 7-justice court is going to go, I think it was 7 justices, and write a story to get out instantly because everybody really wants to know what the Florida Supreme Court is going to do. And I realized that a single person can't do that. And then along the way, the editor-in-chief decided he didn't like my lead and wanted it changed. And and that was something I'd never experienced with the Supreme Court because at the Supreme Court I would always get to go watch the entire argument and then come out and write my story. When the case got to the Supreme Court, and I've not forgotten, there were two hearings at the Supreme Court. There was the earlier case and then the case that became Bush v. Gore. I've forgotten which one this was, but we're all there and we're in the argument and we're packed in the courtroom, and we as reporters are all, at least those of us who need to file quickly, are all thinking, what am I going to write? How am I going to get out of here quickly at the end of the argument? And at the Supreme Court, if the court is there, the press section's over here, we're in our special area, and the bar is right here in front. And halfway through the Bush v. Gore argument, I saw Greta Van Susteren, who was in the Supreme Court bar section, get up and walk out. At the time, she was a legal analyst for CNN, and she left in the middle of the argument, doing something that I didn't get to do because I was still sitting there, to go tell people on TV what had happened in the first part of the argument. He also had a phenomenon for the first time in the Bush v. Gore case where the court released the audio immediately after the argument ended. And that gave everybody, including my editors, a chance to hear what had happened. And so my little monopoly, my world where I was the only one who was in the argument, was suddenly no more. I had editors saying, oh, you need to get this in the story, you need to get that in the story. And then finally, of course, when the opinion came, and I don't know, let me just ask you, how many of you have a kind of a distinct memory of the moment when the December 12th, 2000, when the Supreme Court issued its opinion, and all these TV reporters are trying to tell the world what had happened, and they're fumbling around trying to figure out what had happened? I'm curious, how many people remember that? Well, okay. Well, it was, I'm told from my TV colleagues, just an extremely embarrassing moment because they looked like they didn't know what they were doing. And I was on the phone with somebody basically doing the same thing, but I didn't have a camera on me. But you had this world where this was a very confusing opinion in terms of figuring out the result, just because of the way it was presented to us. It didn't have what they call the syllabus at the beginning of the opinion that we all rely on. It was a per curiam opinion, so it didn't list the names of the majority justices, and you actually had to go count how many dissents there were to know that it was 5-4. It never, for example, had Justice O'Connor's name never appears anywhere in the opinion. And then the court didn't actually say Bush wins, at least, arguably left open a theoretical possibility that Vice President Gore could try to push for a new recount based on the standards that the court laid out in the opinion. But that was a moment that for the press, in my view, it was an extremely hard task. I think some people think did not look very good, at least in that moment, as they were trying to figure out what the opinion said. So things continued to change when Chief Justice Roberts joined the court in 2005. He was, at least at first, seemed like he wanted to have the court be a more transparent institution than Chief Justice Rehnquist had. And so one thing he did, actually at our request, was he started he arranged for the transcripts of the arguments to be released later in the day. And we actually now get a transcript within a couple hours after the argument ends. And a few hours later, it's released to the public. And so you now have much quicker access to people outside of my little monopoly. And of course, now we have, because we have the same day transcript, our old practice of the consensus, what do you think Justice Kennedy said, has now changed. And we actually have to, at least we have to be aware that the transcript may come out in a few minutes and belie what we said in our initial stories. The court has begun now posting opinions to their website. And while that seems like, of course, that's something they should do, I've not forgotten when they started that, but it was really only a few years ago that they did. And what that has done for those of us who report on the court is it means that while I still get handed a copy of the opinion before that opinion goes on the web, I only have, at most a 5-minute head start on everybody else who has something to say about the opinion. And so when you couple that with this world of blogs, and in particular SCOTUS blog, which really covers the court intensively, and social media, the world in which my colleagues and I used to be able to actually read an opinion, talk to somebody about it before trying to tell the world this is what this opinion is all about, that is definitely gone because in a matter of really seconds, there's going to be a lot of talk on social media. Twitter is what I spend the most time with all manner of people who are interested in the Supreme Court, including some very intelligent ones, law professors and the like who follow the court, giving their take on the Supreme Court opinion. And then you also have the phenomenon that in part because of what I've just talked about, that news organizations are trying to do everything faster and faster. Some people like to enjoy watching at the end of the term the interns who now run copies of the opinions from inside the press room out to the TV reporters outside waiting for them. We all increasingly have multiple people involved in getting the news out. So when Bloomberg covered the gay marriage and healthcare arguments this term, we had actually 3 reporters that were all sort of tasked with leaving the courtroom at a particular time. So I've forgotten who did what. I guess my colleague David was supposed to leave as soon as there was the first good quote from Roberts and Kennedy, and then my colleague Alex was sticking around until a later point, and I stuck around to the very end. Or maybe we did that backwards now, I can't remember. But it's all in the name of trying to provide news more quickly. And one thing that is lost there, and one thing we always had to be careful of, is when my colleague David came out to put a story out with that first good quote from Roberts or Kennedy, David had to be very careful, and what I wrote beforehand to help him out, I had to be very careful to say, we don't know, we don't have the full perspective on this argument yet. This is what Kennedy said in the first 10 minutes, and things often change in the course of an argument. And that's certainly my experience, that you can think something after the first half of an argument and it will look very different at the end. So that is something we have to be careful of. There is, not every news organization is as caught up in this as mine is, as many are. We actually, some of us who write for the fast-moving publications like to make fun of the New York Times because they sort of pride themselves on we're waiting until we've really digested this before we put something out. But there is a purpose to that, which is they recognize that it takes a while to digest some things. So this world has, this faster moving world has fostered some high-profile mistakes. After the first healthcare decision 3 years ago, CNN and Fox both now famously got the opinion wrong. And there's really, the explanation for it is just that they moved too quickly, or they didn't, they moved too quickly and didn't communicate with one another very well, and they just fired the news out before they realized they needed to turn the page and see that there was actually more to it. CNN fessed up to its mistake. Fox still hasn't fessed up to its mistake, although they did do a lot better job of turning quickly and acknowledging, reporting the correct news, which was that the healthcare law was largely upheld. But more broadly, and I think more fundamentally, is that I think there's a real risk of the quality of what the reporting is and the news that people consume. Increasingly, people are not getting that thoughtful, that comprehensive take on a Supreme Court decision that they used to get. My news organization maybe is an extreme, but I think I'm now being told that I am not supposed to provide kind of a full same-day story. It is as if I am now tasked with whatever great insights and quotes and all the like I can get in the first couple hours. That's what we want, and then you need to quickly turn to provide something a little bit different with a different angle. And I think increasingly all of us as news consumers, I know I'm certainly this way on non-Supreme Court news. I consume things in snippets. I get a little bit here on Twitter, a little bit there on a story I just looked at. And the snippets often don't encompass the whole and give me the context that I need to really understand the news. And court opinions, I think it's especially dangerous to both produce news that way and consume it that way because they're hard. And, pick any old Supreme Court decision that you had in your con law class, Marbury versus Madison, and we could probably still have, and you probably did have debates over what exactly that opinion meant. On the way up here, I was rereading the Supreme Court's Fisher decision. It's affirmative action decision from a couple years ago, where the court, it was clearly a decision by committee. It was clearly a compromise decision. They kicked it back to the case back to the Fifth Circuit and said, you didn't really apply strict scrutiny, now apply strict scrutiny. And I'm still not sure what that means, and now the Fisher case is back at the Supreme Court, and I guess the Supreme Court will tell us what that opinion means. But if one is not able to figure out what an opinion means after a couple years or a couple centuries in the case of Marbury, you're certainly, it's going to be even more dangerous to try to say what it means in a matter of a few seconds or a few minutes, and if you're a consumer of news, to rely on that. So I wish now I could tell you I have an answer for this problem, which does really trouble me. I'm always working through it myself. The only answer I can come up with is, on my own part and the part of people who read news, is just a certain amount of vigilance and a recognition that what you read about court opinions or court arguments in the initial seconds is probably going to be flawed or at least incomplete, and recognize that you are missing a big part of what's going on if you rely just on those snippets, especially the early snippets. So that is basically what I came to say. I'm happy to, I would love to take questions. I have opinions on all sorts of things, and I'd be happy to share them. It is I should just say, it's a really fun beat to cover because it's in the middle of history, and I always find myself enjoying talking about it when I'm not on the job, so that makes it that's a good sign for me. So I can answer any aspects of my job, what I do, what I just talked about, what I think the court's going to do in any given case. I will open it up to you.
Yeah, I saw David Savage from the LA Times speak about covering the Supreme Court. And he was saying that I'm Daniel Perino, I'm a 1L. And he felt that this was an interesting time to be covering the court because he felt it was the most politicized it ever been, or at least had been in years and years and years. And I was just wondering if you felt that same way and how you felt that affect kind of policy and whatnot.
Yeah, I think David and I largely agree there. I like to cite in my stories, it's the first time in history that if you line the justices up, and of course it's more complicated than this, but if you line them up, from right to left, you would draw the line here, and the ones over here are all Republican appointees, and the ones over here are all Democratic appointees. And part of that is just this phenomenon that really since Robert Bork, the parties have gotten, the executive branch has gotten better and better at identifying judges and future justices who are going to largely line up with, on an ideological manner. Now, there are all sorts of exceptions to that, and this last term certainly showed a number of those, and certainly what the Chief Justice has done the last few terms with his votes on health care. I think the best explanation is that he is somebody who cares deeply about the institutional integrity of the court, and he thought it was very important not to have an opinion that struck down or gutted the president's biggest domestic accomplishment on a vote that lined up the way I laid it out there. I think he honestly believes what he wrote was, a fair reading of the law as well, but I think that institutional integrity mattered a lot to him. So I very much see the court, really more so than most of my colleagues, and David's probably close to me on this, as a political entity. They hate being called, they hate it when you say that they are, certainly don't say it's a Republican justice, but they really don't like being called a Republican appointed justice. They are all justices, and they believe, and I think they're honest. I think this is what they really believe. They are just trying to interpret the Constitution or the statute in the way that they think is right, and they certainly don't think of themselves as Democrats and Republicans. But I certainly see a phenomenon where very often that is the common denominator or the biggest signal that tells you how a particular justice is going to vote in a case.
Do you think, you say also who you are.
My name's Emma. I'm a 3L. Do you think the court will ever allow cameras? And if so, what impact will that have on reporting?
Let me start with the back half of that. I think from a standpoint of what is good policy, of course they should have cameras. What an educational tool it would be. The public would get to see them. Everything else is televised. And of course, a lot of us are let into the room, and they produce audio recordings and everything. Why can't they have cameras? That said, it would really change my world, and I don't know that it's for the better, because I would be back in that situation where I'm covering the Florida Supreme Court. So the healthcare case is argued, and instead of being in the room, my editors want me to be watching a TV screen and reporting as I watch it. And you just can't do both those things at the same time. You can't watch and try to figure out what all these different questions mean, which way the court's going to go, and write a story. And take notes. I just can't do all that. So I think it would be a nightmare for my personal world. In terms of whether they're going to, what always happens, every time you get a new justice appointed to the court, in the confirmation hearing, they talk about how they're at least open to having cameras, or I experienced it in the Third Circuit and it seemed like it was fine, or this, that, and the other thing. And then they get on the court and they're like, well, my colleagues feel really strongly, they don't want cameras, and they become, as time goes on, they become more protective of the institution. And what I think is driving the justices mostly is just this, the court moves at a glacial pace on everything. That's why, all the stuff I was talking about took forever to get a transcript out, which seems easy, or to have to be posting opinions on the website. They change things really, really slowly there. And I think there is a sense of, we don't know what's going to happen if we change it. We've gone without cameras for 2 centuries, and maybe the lawyers will act differently, maybe my colleagues will act differently, maybe I'll act differently, I just would rather keep it the way it is. And I think that's eventually what most of them, the point of view that most of them adopt. Eventually, yeah, there will be cameras because we're just, I mean, you know, we're in a world where there are cameras almost everywhere now. And so it's hard to imagine that, you know, 50, 100 years from now, there won't be cameras. But, you know, 10 years from now, I don't think so.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a 1L. Talking about the monopoly you used to have, and maybe you don't have it so much now, there are still only a circumscribed amount of reporters in the room, right? So Bloomberg, The Post, The Times, whatever. What is your relationship with the commentator outlets that are going to be pulling from your articles and sending it out into the world? So I'm thinking of gay marriage. You had Gawker Media explode. You had ESPN doing stuff. You had The Atlantic writing things. Do you interact with those reporters? Do you try to correct them? Do you try to expand upon their insights, especially when they're pulling from these monopoly articles from the Times, from the Post, that sort of thing?
I'm glad you asked it because I just meant to mention them in what I was saying before, that you do have commentators. And so Professor Feldman is actually writes for Bloomberg and just amazingly quickly will give his opinion on an opinion or some other development from the court. And you know, the quality of commentators, just, you know, like anything, it varies dramatically. So the short answer is I don't have a whole lot of relationship. It's not like Professor Feldman and I are emailing each other. I mean, you know, we've met a couple times. You know, I enjoy talking to him. But it's not like, you know, he's got his job, I've got my job, and we kind of do them separately. You know, lines are blurring in the media. It's another thing I'm not comfortable with. In fact, I was noticing, maybe I misperceived it, but I was on the Washington Post website on my phone on the way up here, and I was just noticing on there that there was no demarcation between here's a news story and here's an opinion, which used to be a real, you know, firm line in journalism. And I think that's part of this phenomenon where not only are we all getting snippets of news based on not complete information, it's not always clear whether the person, I mean, when I write a story, I'm trying to be fair. I'm trying to give you the whole story. I'm not trying to convince you that one side or the other is right. And, you know, Noah Feldman has a different agenda, and it's really important for news organizations to make clear, you know, who's who. And I think, you know, basically we are increasingly falling down on that job.
Well, I'm Iran, and I'm here. My question is, do you think the justices will read the Bloomberg report and the public relation concern will have an influence over their decisions or behaviors?
I think some of them do. I think it depends on the justice. I don't know how many of them read Bloomberg, but let's take the New York Times. I know that some of them read the New York Times on both sides of the spectrum, read the New York Times, and you know, you will occasionally hear something from one of them that makes clear that they didn't like an article or that they, you know. Justice Thomas, for example, says that he reads very little of the press coverage of him or the court, and I tend to believe him. Justice Kagan, I think, she is. I think she is very savvy in terms of she definitely does. She is very aware of what is said about the court and about her, and there are certainly Justice Sotomayor. You know, there may be a little bit of a phenomenon of the newer justices pay more attention than the older justices, but it varies.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm a 1L. I was just wondering if you could give us a little insight into your transition from law student, law alum into covering the court. Was that something you always wanted to do? Was it a pivot that happened after working in other legal fields? How did you end up covering the court?
So I came here, so I graduated from here in '95, and I came here basically because I was interested in the law, and not that I necessarily wanted to be a lawyer. And I was open to working at a law firm to pay off the bills, and I came here, and I liked being in law school, but I found what I spent a lot of my time doing was being the editor of the Record. And so I clerked for a judge for a year, a federal district judge, and decided it would be easier for me to, if I wanted to go into journalism, to do it right then rather than work at a law firm for a few years and then try to make the shift. So I went to Bloomberg right after the clerkship. So I started at Bloomberg in 1996, and I started covering the court a couple of years later, and that's basically been it.
Hi, my name is Hassan. I'm a 1L. Being so close to the court as you are, do you get any insight into the sort of secret closed-door deliberations that happen between the justices themselves when they're deciding an argument? Yeah, thank you.
I would love to tell you I have a lot of that. They're really good at, the court is about as leak-proof an institution as there is in Washington. Occasionally somebody will come up with a scoop on some really big case. So as an example, the healthcare case from a few years ago, Jan Crawford of, I guess she was with ABC then. Maybe she was with CBS. Anyway, she came out with a story that essentially said Roberts initially voted with the conservative wing to strike down the healthcare law, or at least the individual mandate, and then he switched his vote. And a few other people got little tidbits of details there. I'm still not totally sure that that's exactly what happened, but that sort of thing is really rare. And I would love to know more, but in general, we all have to wait till some justices' papers come out, and usually those come out, decades after the people who covered the decision in the first place are have long since retired or died.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm a 1L. I think we can all agree the last year for the Supreme Court has been a particularly exciting year, and I'm wondering, looking forward into the next year, if there's any decisions that you're particularly looking forward to or that are exciting for you that you think will be particularly important.
I don't think it's going to be as good as last year. Very few terms are. In fact, in the last several years, we've gotten a little bit spoiled that we've pretty much always had at least one blockbuster. This term, right now, I think the best case that they've granted already is one having to do with mandatory union dues or fees to cover the cost of collective bargaining. The Supreme Court is considering overturning the law, overturning the decision that said that it's not a First Amendment violation to require public sector workers to pay their share. We will probably get an abortion case. There's a really good chance we'll get an abortion case out of Texas. We will, I think probably, although they don't have to take it, we'll get another case involving the contraceptive mandate and whether the administration's religious accommodation is sufficient. That's a case, though, where every appeals court that has ruled on it has ruled in the administration's favor. And so the court doesn't have, it's really the circuit split that makes everybody think, okay, the court has to take this issue. If they don't want to take it, if they don't think there's a reason, they don't have to take that one. There's one other thing I'm forgetting about, but I don't know if we're going to get a Voting Rights Act case this term. I don't think we'll get Obama's immigration executive order. I don't think we'll get that this term. You know, it'll be okay, but it won't be. We won't have gay marriage again, and we won't have health care again. I don't think. So, Dean.
I'm still the dean. Thanks so much for being here. It's fantastic. I'd love your perspective on the non-blockbuster cases. The court does a lot of things that are very significant, but they're not a dinner table conversation for everyone. How do you approach those cases? What do you wish people understood about them? Whether it's ones that affect workers or business community or others, and a similar question about constitutional versus statutory or regulatory cases. Particularly given the changes you describe, the monopoly is not just ending for reporters, it's ending for lawyers. Anybody can read, except when you get away from these blockbuster cases, nobody knows what we're talking about. So how do you approach these non-famous cases?
Well, I would say, let me start by saying, even in the blockbusters, I mean, I had to spend a lot of time telling people that the healthcare case from last term was not a constitutional case. I mean, everybody at Bloomberg wanted to say the court was considering, declaring it unconstitutional. So even in those, kind of that basic level of here's what the court is doing is hard. It is, I guess I would say, well, let me divide the cases into two categories. Some cases just have great facts and they're fun to write about regardless. I mean, putting aside the legal issue, the woman who tried to poison her husband's her neighbor, who also happened to be her husband's lover by putting chemicals all over her doorknobs and stuff like that. And whether that amounted to could be a federal crime, that was just a fun case for people to write about. And there are others like that. But then you get plenty of cases that are ERISA preemption or something that are not nearly as interesting. What I have, so my real answer to you is sometimes it's a struggle. It is, there's a certain category of cases where I'm not interested in, I'm going to be tough getting the reader to be interested in the legal issues, and what I probably default to more than I should, what often my editors want me to default to, is the impact of it. And especially at a place like Bloomberg, where what we really, I'm told, we really want to know, is this actually going to, cut back on the number of class action lawsuits, or have some other big effect. And that is especially the case with the statutory cases. Usually with the constitutional case, you can get people interested enough by talking about the citing James Madison or something like that, that at least gives people a sense that it's a big, a big fundamental issue they should care about.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a 1L. Thank you very much for being here. Tying together some of the things you've been talking about, and I think some of the things we've all observed with the running of the interns and the cameras in the courtroom and all of these issues, as media gets faster and as people want to know more sooner and the court's more politicized, and these all really do seem to just feed on themselves and create a cycle we can't get out of. Mm-hmm. So if we were to make you puppeteer and you could roll back the clock, would you? To the Warren era where we didn't need news on the go, or would you not, and why, and how would you roll us back to a simpler time?
Well, so my question is, do I have to also roll back my ability to get news on Twitter about my favorite baseball team? No, because I don't want to lose.
You can cover Brown v. Board on Twitter if you want. That's a tough question. There is unquestionably value in all this, right? We're all getting, sometimes news just didn't make it out back in that era, right? If it doesn't, there was a time, if there wasn't space in the newspaper, it couldn't fit in there. I mean, you didn't get it. So now there's, there are no space limitations. So if what you really care about is the bankruptcy case, or the
whatever, the habeas case, anything that that matters to you, whether it is really important or you know, somebody else might say not important, you can find that out, and there's a lot of value to that. And then the trade-off is sort of what I've described. So, you know, I'm not so much of a dinosaur that I actually think, you know, the world was all better back in the 1950s, but you know, I just lament a little bit what we are losing along the way.
Hi, I'm Cameron, 1L. So you've mentioned several of the high-profile cases from this cycle, and it's appeared that there's been more scrutiny on the Supreme Court as an institution after this past year, and I'm sure this is partially due to it being an election cycle, as much of it is from political candidates, but also from commentators as well. So I'm curious what your take is on if there's a heightened level of scrutiny now, you believe, or if it now has started to seep into the mainstream of public opinion.
I'm intrigued that you asked the question in general because it sounds like you perceive that there's more scrutiny. You know, sometimes it's hard for me to tell whether there is. It's what I do, so I'm used to scrutinizing the court. That said, I mean, I think when the court is deciding really big stuff, and it has decided some really big stuff in the last few years, I mean, that, you know, necessarily puts more focus on the court. I do think the election matters. I think the fact that the court is more politicized matters, and again, by politicized, you heard my answer before. You know what I mean. Not that they are not in factions on the court necessarily, but that the court is more viewed as a political body. I think it's fascinating if you watch some of the opinion polls. The favorable, unfavorable ratings of the Supreme Court. You know, right now, it's sky high for Democrats. Democrats love the court. Republicans hate the court. And if the court, overturns, they're not going to overturn Casey, but if they, in the abortion case, do something really big there, you can expect some of that to go back the other direction. I think there's a little bit more, and I think we're also coming at this election. I've now forgotten exactly how I described it, but I think it's the case that on election day you will have 4 justices who are at least 78. I think that's right, and that will be the first time that's ever happened on election day. So just that fact alone suggests to you that the next president has got a really good chance of shaping the court in a big way. Now, I don't think that, in general, the court is never really an election issue, but it is certainly at least something that the candidates are going to talk about, if for no other reason, to motivate their bases, which is what they're essentially doing right now.
Hi, I'm Becky. I'm a 1L. And I was curious if you could talk a little more about, given the fast nature of Supreme Court coverage now, what you have to do to prepare before a case. Like, I understand with the gay marriage case, you had over 15 leads prepared, and what is the process? How do you consider what might happen and get yourself ready so you can write quickly?
Yeah. So I spend way too much time having to do this, but it's the nature of the business. Yeah. I basically think out loud a lot, so I spend a lot of time talking through, and I've got some, there's some colleagues, like the reporter, I probably shouldn't say this, but the reporter for AP, covers the court for AP, reporter covers the court for Dow Jones, are 2 good friends of mine, and we love, the AP reporter and I especially, just love sort of talking through, maybe the court could do this, maybe the court could do that. And so I've sort of found that what I want to avoid doing when I'm handed an orders list or an opinion, I want to avoid having to think, because that's when I can get in trouble. So I want to prepare something for every possibility that I can come up with, because if I'm having to write it on the fly, then there's just a lot more danger that I will have missed some important aspect either of the decision or my sentence structure that will make it not quite right. So I just for the big cases. I come up with every lead I can think of. And part of it is, actually, maybe this will make it a little more concrete. In 2003, when the court decided the Grutter and Gratz cases, the University of Michigan affirmative action cases, the court had both cases at the same time, and they were independent from each other. And one thing you have to think about is when they announce an opinion, so the gay marriage cases were all consolidated. You knew you were going to get one opinion. That was going to give you the answer. You know, it's either a constitutional right or something else. With Grutter and Gratz, you didn't know for sure whether you were going to get the Gratz opinion or the Grutter opinion. And if you got the Gratz opinion first, and I can't believe I can't remember which one we actually got first, you might have a story that says the court put restrictions on affirmative action. And if you get the Grutter opinion first, you would say the court upheld affirmative action. And having to think through how to write in that little window of time, in the 10 minutes between Gratz and Grutter, writing this opinion and writing this story and saying, but hang on, there's another one coming. And, essentially, Gratz and Grutter, even though I can't remember which one came out first, came out more or less the way I expected and most people expected. So you kind of knew that Grutter would be the more important of the two. So in writing the Gratz, preparing for Gratz, you had to say, they did this, but you had to very quickly say, but hang on, there's another one coming that could be even more important.
Hi, thank you for coming here today. I'm Wendy, I'm an LLM student. I actually have two questions. The first question I have is, what would you say is the highlight of your professional career so far? And the second question I have is, having graduated from Harvard, do you have any words of wisdom for the current students?
Oh boy, that's the question I should have prepared for, and the second half of that. Well, maybe after I answer the first question, I'll have come up with something for the second one. I think I've talked about most of the highlights. I mean, the coolest part of the job is, and the biggest rush is being handed that opinion in that brief window of time when I've got the opinion and I'm trying to figure out what it is, and I know what the court has done, and I'm just dying to tell the world, and just being there for that moment is, to me, what makes it fun. And just kind of looking back, knowing that it's always hard to see history when you're in the middle of it. But, they made a lot of history at the end of June this year. And, as I look back on Bush v. Gore, I can say to myself, wow, I was, in that argument. I was handed that opinion. And actually, let me just, sorry, I'm going in circles, but one thing about Bush v. Gore, actually, if I could pick out one single moment of Bush v. Gore. So if you all remember, or maybe you can't remember because you were in second grade then, it was a Friday night. The Florida Supreme Court surprised everybody by saying the recounts could start up again. And on Saturday morning, and I actually can't, it's funny, I sort of think back at how life was different then. Like, nobody told me I should go to the U.S. Supreme Court on that Saturday, but I just kind of figured something might happen there. I should be there, and I actually should have gotten there earlier in the morning. But I got there, and it was about 12:30 in the afternoon. We got the Supreme Court stay order. That for the first time, because up until then, if you recall, the Bush versus Palm Beach County case, the court had been unanimous in just kind of kicking the case back and not deciding anything too big. But on that Saturday, and I think it was about 12:30, they give us the stay order where on a 5-4 vote, the court is staying the recounts in Florida. And you have 4 dissenters, and Justice Scalia, who's part of the majority, decides he's going to respond to Justice Stevens in dissent. And all of a sudden in that moment, you had this big national drama that lasted for 5 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks. And it was at the moment, I'm like, wow, now I see how it's all going to end. It's like, on this piece of paper, the Supreme Court's going to decide 5-4, and George Bush is going to be president. So that was sort of like the biggest the moment that I still can't believe I was there for. What advice do I have? I don't know. Hopefully you're here because you like the law. Probably not all of you do. Probably more of you do because you're here, or at least you're interested enough about the Supreme Court to be here. That was why I went to law school, because I thought it was interesting. I thought it was, my classmates were really, really smart, and getting to hang out with them and talk about the law with them. The legal market is tough now, much like the journalism market. So, what you're going to do with this degree, I'm sure Dean Minow has all sorts of great suggestions for you, but hopefully you're in the middle of something you really enjoy and you can continue to be in the middle of that one way or another. Or if you don't, I'm sure it, help make you more thoughtful and smarter people, and whatever you, do with it outside of the law. I think it for almost everybody will be a good experience. So, not much of an answer.
Hi, my name is Chen Yuan. I'm LM student for this year. So my question is, can you share your experience on writing of a news report? How do you come up with a eye-catching headline? And how do you come up with an idea or legal argument or analysis that other people haven't thought of? What is the difference between a news report writing on a legal topic and a general thing like a news report? Thank you.
I'm bad at headlines. The headline's always the last thing I write, and I don't like doing it, which is probably doesn't endear me to my editors. The second part of your question, finding something that other people haven't said, that feels like it's increasingly hard, because there are so many people writing about the Supreme Court in so many different forums, and a lot of them have said really, really interesting stuff, and it's hard to have an original thought at this point. So I find that to be more and more challenging. You just, you try to think, and you try to read, and you try to, talk to people and come up with something. I'm sorry, I forgot the last part of your question.
Maybe I should rephrase the question. So you were talking about Professor Feldman. He also writes things or article on the Bloomberg. So from a journalist perspective, how do you think is a unique contribution that journalists can make? That because everybody can write, right?
Well, first I should say Professor Feldman is a lot smarter than I am. I mean, he's although I disagree with him, frequently, but he is really nimble and writes well and is very, very thoughtful. What I try to do, and I think what is the most important thing I can do, is to try to write that comprehensive, fair article where you can come to me and think, I trust this guy. He doesn't have an agenda. As I said, I've got opinions on all sorts of stuff, but the opinions are kind of like, it tend to be things like, well, why'd they even take up that case? That was a bad case for them to take up. It's not that I think Justice so-and-so was right and Justice so-and-so was wrong. But I'm going to try to give you a fair description and analysis of what has happened. That I think is something that we have increasingly lost in this world. So, and I think a lot of my colleagues do a very good job of that too. So that's what I think journalists, or at least non-opinion journalists, contribute.
You do a fabulous